We've talked about how having a stable value for a currency, not too much inflation, ideally avoiding deflation, is a central part of maintaining a good functioning currency and how that's related to monetary policy. And so we're going to talk through how monetary policy works in the context of the United States. So in the United States, the central bank, right, is the organization that manages currency value and the supply of currency in circulation is the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve sets currency policy. It was created by Congress and given sort of expansive powers to control the printing press and manage the supply of dollars in circulation. Now, this Federal Reserve has a whole bunch of tools it can use to do that. It can regulate banks and change how much banks are supposed to keep on hand. It can change how much it lends money to banks at the Fed funds rate. But the primary tool that it uses to manage the supply of currency in circulation is through the Fed's Open Markets Committee, where the Federal Reserve will buy and sell Treasury bonds, and in doing so changes the interest rate that the US government has to pay when it borrows money to finance its debt, right? The US government spends more than it takes in, so it has to issue debt or issue bonds to be able to get cash to pay for its bills. Well, the Federal Reserve, through the Open Markets Committee, determines what those interest rates look like, and by buying and selling Treasury bonds. And you might ask the question, well, where does the Federal Reserve get its money to do that? And the answer is the Treasury Department. But let me walk you through what that process looks like in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the way that this works is that the US government needs to borrow money, right? US government runs deficits, and it has essentially two choices for where it can get that money. It can borrow that money from the Federal Reserve, which will print money indirectly. Give me a second there. Will print money to essentially cover that debt. Or the US government can borrow money from private sector banks or private sector investors, right? Those are essentially your two choices. So when the federal government realizes that it needs to borrow money, right, when they start writing checks and they find that they're approaching zero on their balance, they hold an auction for Treasury bills, and they invite in major investors, major banks to come and say, would you like to buy some US government debt? And many banks do. They're interested in buying US government debt. US government debt is incredibly safe as an investment because the US government is generally considered a good, safe place to put money, that the US government pays its bills and has always done so throughout basically its entire history. Small caveat, basically its entire history. So the Fed shows up at this meeting as well. And the Fed shows up with sort of a sense of whether it thinks interest rates should go up or whether it thinks interest rates should go down. And we'll talk about how this then affects currency and circulation. And so if the Fed shows up and decides that it wants to see interest rates going up, it sort of hangs out in the back of the room and lets the Treasury Secretary start that auction, right? And so the Treasury Secretary wants to get a good deal for the United States, and so he or she will say, okay, we're going to sell, millions of dollars or billions of dollars of US government debt. Who wants to buy that debt at a 0.5% interest rate, sort of annual sort of return that will pay you an extra 0.5% as interest? And maybe nobody raises their hand. And so the Federal Reserve Chairman will, or the Treasury Secretary will say, well, how about 1%? Or how about 2%? At some point, banks are going to jump in and say, oh, I will buy it 2%, or I will buy it 3%. That's an interest rate I would like to see on this debt, and I'll give you money for it. But if the Federal Reserve decides that that's not high enough for an interest rate, they'll sort of interrupt the auction and say, hey guys, over here, you want to buy US government debt, right? I have hundreds of billions of dollars of US government debt that I've accumulated over the years, and the US government will give you 2%, I'll give you 3%. Or the US government will give you 3%, I'll give you 4%. And so all of a sudden those bankers come over to the Federal Reserve and they start buying US government debt from the Federal Reserve at a higher interest rate. And so then suddenly if the US government wants to be able to sell its debt to finance its operations, to pay its bills, it has to pay that higher interest rate. And so essentially the Federal Reserve can drive up those interest rates by being willing to sell US government debt at a higher interest rate. Now, the Federal Reserve decides that they want the interest rate to go down, right? When the Fed chairman, when the Treasury Secretary starts that bidding process and says 0.5%, 1%, and the bankers don't raise their hand and say, yeah, I'll take that government debt, the Federal Reserve Chairman will just raise his or her hand and say, we'll buy at 1.5%. And if any of these bankers want some US government debt, they're going to have to buy at 1.5% too. Otherwise, I'll just buy it all. Right? So essentially, because the Fed is such a huge player, they can set the price wherever they want. Now, the question still is, where does the Federal Reserve get the money? So after that Treasury auction, the Fed Reserve Chairman walks up to the front of the room and metaphorically writes a check to the Treasury Secretary and hands the Treasury Secretary the check. Again, this is metaphorical, but it's essentially the process. And says to the Secretary of the Treasury, now don't cash this right away, give me some time. And the head of the Federal Reserve races back to his or her office and calls up the Secretary of the Treasury who just got back to his or her office. And the head of the Federal Reserve says, look, so I just bought $300 billion worth of US government debt. And the Secretary of the Treasury said, yes, I know, I was there. Thank you very much. That was really kind of you. We appreciate that. And the Federal Reserve Chairman says, yeah, but I don't really have $300 billion on hand. Would you do me a favor? Would you flip on the printing press and run $300 billion for me? And the Secretary of the Treasury says, I would love to. Secretary of the Treasury runs down the hall, turns on the printing press. The printing press prints out $300 billion. The Treasury then takes the $300 billion, brings it over to the Federal Reserve. They deposit it in the bank. The Chairman of the Federal Reserve calls up the Secretary of the Treasury and says, I've got my, $300 billion I need it now. You can cash that check. The money then goes from the Federal Reserve back over to the Treasury, and now the Treasury can pay its bills. Now, this is ridiculous, right? All that we essentially saw is that the US government printed money and used that to buy debt and then is paying its bills with printed money. But the reason why we did that ridiculous runaround of moving money back and forth and the phone calls back and forth is that Congress put the Federal Reserve in between the Treasury and the printing press. The Secretary of the Treasury can only flip on that printing press and print dollars when asked to by the Chairman of the Federal Reserve. And what that ensures is that the Federal Reserve is in control of when the printing press turns on and when the printing press turns off. Now, changing interest rates through this process has a whole host of effects above and beyond just flipping the printing press on and off. It has effects that sort of ripple across the entire economy, because if you have higher interest rates, then that's money that banks have that they're going to say, well, the US government is willing to pay me 4% or 5% interest on money that I lend it, right? That's going to be more money going to the federal government, and that's less money that's available for the private sector, for people to get student loans or car loans or home loans or small business loans to finance economic activity in the private sector. And when you do have more economic activity in the private sector, it's going to cost more, right? Because banks are going to look at me and say, why would I give you a car loan at 4% when I can give my money to the federal government for 4% interest? The federal government's way more trustworthy than you. If you want me to lend you money, you have to give me 6.5%, because you're just not as trustworthy as the federal government in terms of paying your bills. And that's actually fair. I don't have a printing press that I can use to print dollars whenever I need them. So that's a fair argument. But what that ends up meaning is that higher interest rates paid by the federal government means that there's less lending that takes place in the private sector, because lending costs more. You have to pay a higher interest rate to borrow money. And so there's just less economic activity happening in the private sector. If you have lower interest rates, right, if the chairman of the Federal Reserve steps in and drives those interest rates down, then suddenly banks are looking at that saying, well, that's not a really good, interest rate on my money. Maybe I'll let the Federal Reserve buy up all that debt. I won't invest there. And now banks have all this money that they're looking to put someplace. And so they start investing in businesses. They start investing in mortgages. They start investing in all these other places that they can lend money. And that funnels money into the private sector. And so you get all sorts of extra economic activity that's happening, not just because banks have more money on hand, but because that money is affordable. People can borrow that money at a low interest rate, and that makes it easier to get access to those loans. And it makes it so that people can purchase more, borrow more. Okay, so when we talk about these interest rates, we talk about a tight money policy versus a loose money policy. A tight money policy is interest rates going higher. And this has a whole bunch of effects, right? Interest rates going higher means that the Federal Reserve is not asking the Treasury Department to run the printing press but instead is driving those interest rates up. And so you're going to have less inflation. You're going to have less inflation because you're not running the printing press, and you're going to have less inflation because interest rates are going up, economic activity is slowing, you're not having the surge of money into an economy that comes with additional lending. And so inflation is likely to stay lower. Higher interest rates will keep inflation low, but if you push interest rates up too high, you can actually push into deflation. So you have to be careful with jacking up interest rates. One of the nice things that happens with higher interest rates is that you get higher levels of foreign investment. Money pours in from around the world because, oh my gosh, the US government is paying this really great interest rate. They're paying a lot, and lots of people want to invest in US government debt or in any sort of US investment because everything is linked to that higher interest rate. But that also means that loans for the private sector end up being more expensive. And that means less business activity. And that means it means higher unemployment. And so there's a negative consequence to raising those interest rates in terms of the real economy. A loose money policy is the sort of flip of that, right? The Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates low, and they're doing that by running the printing press. And so you're increasing the money supply, and that means potentially you could get higher inflation. And that's particularly the case if you're at full employment, right? As long as you can always run your factories for longer or produce more stuff, maybe you can accommodate that increase in the money supply. But at some point, you start bumping up against the constraints of how much your economy can produce. And if you just keep running the printing press, then you get in that situation of too much money, too few goods, and inflation. So lower interest rates can lead to inflation. They are also going to reduce foreign investment. Money's not going to come in because people are going to look at the US economy and they're going to say interest rates are really low. Why would I invest my money here when I can invest my money in Germany or France or Britain or Japan, places that have maybe higher interest rates? But the good news is that with those low interest rates, banks are going to be lending more money out to the private sector, and that money is going to be affordable. And so there's going to be all this new building and all this new economic activity, and that's going to push down unemployment. And so a loose monetary policy pushes down unemployment. A tight monetary policy, higher interest rates, drives up unemployment. And what that means is that different people have different preferences over what happens with monetary policy. And to sort of thread that needle, when Congress created the Federal Reserve, they gave it a dual mandate. Now, not every central bank has a dual mandate. The European Central Bank, which manages the euro, does not have a dual mandate. It's only targeted at keeping inflation low. But in the United States, the Federal Reserve has to keep its eye on two goals. It has to keep its eye on keeping inflation low, and has to keep its eye on keeping unemployment low. So to hit one of those goals, you need to raise interest rates to keep inflation low. To hit the other goal, you need to push interest rates down to keep unemployment down, to keep economic activity growing. So there's always this tension. Now, how the Federal Reserve manages this has changed over time. At the end of World War II, the Federal Reserve said, we can tolerate higher levels of inflation. What we really need is to pay off debt from World War II. What we really need is to keep the US economy roaring. And so the Federal Reserve targeted 2% unemployment. And we're willing to have 5 or 6% inflation. Over time, that inflation went up from 5 or 6 or 7 or 8% into the 10s and 20s. And so there's been a sort of a reshifting and a recalibrating. The Federal Reserve now targets about 2% inflation and 5 to 6% unemployment. And they've sort of decided that that's a stable environment in terms of managing that dual mandate. It's going to retain economic prosperity across the board and avoid economic inflation. Now, I would point out that different segments of the economy care about different goals, right? That this dual mandate affects people differently. And so if you are a worker, right, or just a person who's poor who doesn't have a lot of money in the bank, then you probably want loose monetary policy. You want unemployment to be low, because if unemployment is low, that means people are going to be fighting over your labor and wages will go up. And that's good. And if there's a little bit of inflation, well, it doesn't really matter because you don't own anything. You don't have any assets. You don't have big piles of cash sitting in the bank that are going to become worth less money or less value because of inflation. But if you're a banker, then inflation is a really scary thing. Or if you're wealthy, if you have huge piles of cash, then if you run the printing presses and you have inflation, that means that your huge piles of cash are going to be able to buy less stuff. And so you would want a tight monetary policy. You would want very low inflation, maybe even deflation. Deflation essentially means that you can sit on your pile of cash, you can do nothing with it, and it increases in value over time. And so that dual mandate is actually um, a political knot in terms of different actors wanting different things, and how we resolve that and what that looks like can be really difficult and really complicated and really and have real consequences for people's lives.